For a while, Donkey Kong Country Returns HD felt like one of the most forgettable and bland remasters Nintendo had ever published, until they dropped a patch that quietly changed everything. The remaster originally dropped in January 2025 to a pretty lukewarm reception, mainly because of some weirdly frequent audio mixing issues and visual glitches that weren't present in the Wii or 3DS version. That immediately sparked a debate on whether the Switch version could even be considered the definitive release. This update, however, has pretty much settled that discussion. A character port from Tropical Freeze, tons of bug fixes, and visual improvements aimed at the Switch 2 finally pushed me to give this game another chance. My only real question is, why now? Nintendo needed a direct more than ever. Mostly because their first holiday with the Switch 2's release was so horrible. Obviously, I'm sure we've all heard this Nintendo take echoed over the past few months. Should these random drops have been in a dedicated direct? I mean, probably. Nintendo's first-party release slate has been pretty barren to start the year, other than Mario Tennis Fever and Tamagotchi Life, with Pokemon Gen 10 on the horizon. We haven't heard much, but I'll take free content shadow drops in the dry season of a generation any day. 2 months before the release of Returns HD, Nintendo hosted a direct relating to the new section of Super Nintendo World being entirely themed around Donkey Kong Country. There are tons of references to Returns, which I do think fueled Nintendo's desire to get a remaster done before Bonanza's announcement. As a DKC fan, it was really exciting to see Nintendo give more recognition to Donkey Kong throughout 2025, especially with Bonanza's release. DK is really starting to become a massive Nintendo franchise, and I can't wait to see where his games go next. The development history behind Returns HD is honestly strange to think about now. Metroid Prime Remastered was developed by Retro Studios, who were gearing up to work on Metroid Prime 4. It was released as a shadow drop in February of 2023, right after a Nintendo Direct. Prime Remastered was praised for its fair pricing of $40 and stunning graphics remade from the ground up. Returns was originally developed by Retro Studios, however, Returns HD was not remastered by Retro. I'm guessing there weren't many legacy developers who knew Returns' old development style deeply enough to warrant giving Retro an extra platformer project while they're in the middle of Metroid Prime 4. Donkey Kong Country Returns HD was remastered by Forever Entertainment and developed in Unity instead of Retro's in-house engine, which I assume was for Switch compatibility reasons, but that's at least partially responsible for all the odd visual and audio glitches. Having to port everything over to Unity probably wasn't easy, but the fact that Returns HD was 6 months between reveal and release was on the longer side for most Nintendo games, let alone a remaster. So expectations started to rise more than usual, especially with the Paper Mario Thousand Year Door remaster being overwhelmingly positive. So the first thing I should mention for context is that this remaster is of the 3DS version, so you get all the new features the 3DS had, like modern and original mode, the bonus World 9, and finally being able to roll with a button, if we really want to call that a feature. Either way though, this decision was made with the vision of releasing the definitive version of Returns, and it definitely got me excited to play the 3DS exclusive levels in HD. The initial reveal trailers looked fine enough. Returns HD seemed like it ran well, although some scenes looked a little darker than they should have at first glance, but everyday users probably didn't notice. Most of the key scenes that were buggy at launch didn't appear in the trailers for obvious reasons, at least from the marketing material I saw, so I just put Returns HD in the back of my mind after making my retrospective on the Wii version, and didn't bother following up till I caught wind of the controversy. At launch, Returns HD was slammed by many critics and consumers for being too basic of a remaster, which is nothing new for Nintendo. I mean, did we completely gloss over Luigi's Mansion 2 HD? They were both ported from the 3DS and look fine on their own, but is it worth remastering and slapping on a $60 price tag? That's mostly up to the individual. But it was clear there were a ton of technical issues that the 3DS brought in on top of the Unity port issues. First off, there were frame drops reported on the Switch 1 near the end of the game. The sun didn't rise or shine correctly in 1-3. The giant purple bat's laser beams weren't being layered correctly. Quite a few background artifacts and geometry weren't upscaled like the rest. Cranky Kong not having new detailed fur, and Donkey Kong, while no longer having a completely flat texture for fur, sports a new hybrid model between his Returns and Tropical Freeze look. However, it's clear his fur was still a bit dark in contrast to the brighter levels in Returns HD. Multiplayer was also broken in some areas. On the Wii version, when playing levels that required both players to bounce off a single enemy, there would be a buffer period to allow the second player to land on the same enemy. In the 3DS version, one player would just fall into the abyss, and Forever Entertainment did not initially fix that glitch, breaking multiplayer entirely for certain late game levels. The load times and file size are the biggest offenders. I don't know how, but on my Switch 2, Returns HD is 16 gigabytes, which is insanity compared to Tropical Freeze. This is another side effect to porting everything to Unity. The load times are somehow worse on Switch 2 compared to the Wii. That is just unacceptable as a remaster of a Wii game on a next-gen console. Finally, the original Retro developers' names weren't displayed in the credits, which is incredibly disappointing to the people who worked on the game originally, but at this point, most people's TikTok brains aren't reading the credits anyway, and this game hasn't been touched by Retro since the Wii, because Monster Games developed the 3DS port. All three companies deserve their names in the credits for their contributions regardless. So yeah, that was a lot of negative in quick succession, but this is where the story actually gets interesting. I know there's some points that made the game look worse than others, but in reality, it was just a below par port. However, Forever Entertainment decided to shadow drop an update that would change everything, as it tackled basically every criticism people had about the game. They fixed the multiplayer glitch, which is a huge talking point for many players who only wanted to play in multiplayer. They fixed the Rising Sun in 1-3, so it shines like the original, with the same lighting effects as well. The water effects have improved across the board, and this update has re-added animations that were only present in the Wii version, which is a nice touch. Some other key model issues like DK's fur not matching the lighting of the level, the bat layering, and fire rings not having a texture is completely fixed, which is refreshing to see that Forever Entertainment and Nintendo are actually listening to major criticism. My only minor complaint in terms of what they missed is there is still a ton of audio mixing inconsistencies, like jumping into a level. DK's voice line doesn't even finish before it fades out, which is really strange if you played the original. I also wondered if it was just my capture card, but randomly the audio cuts out once in a while, which didn't happen to me in any other games, but let me know in the comments if y'all had the same issues I did. They added this weird turbo attack mode where everything is sped up, and you have a time limit to reach the goal. It's a creative idea and could probably only be done on Switch, but it doesn't really change why I'm buying the game or anything. It's just a decent challenge mode. Game share is also finally supported, allowing this game to not be limited by couch co-op. I haven't personally tried game share for myself, so I can't say much there, but hopefully it runs well and solves Nintendo's problem with couch co-op games not having online functionality with friends. The biggest change by far though is the addition of Dixie Kong. She's entirely a backport from Tropical Freeze down to the model. I can tell, because she's slightly uncanny when standing next to DK's Wii model. It's a solid backport, and I really do enjoy Dixie more than Diddy because of her hair twirl mechanic, boosting you upward quite a bit. But that's also a double-edged sword, because Returns is not built for Dixie Kong's physics, making puzzles and other platforming challenges broken or much easier. Overall though, this game is so old that it's fine to add a bunch of options regardless of whether it makes the game easier. As long as you can still play as Diddy Kong and the original mode exists, that's fine enough for me. This update mostly focused on visual fixes and the Dixie Kong port, with some small bug fixes here and there. It's a fine free update, but does this actually feel like the definitive version of the game? Donkey Kong Country Returns HD nowadays is a pretty solid re-release. I could always make the argument that they should have priced this at $50, especially with the way it was performing on the original Switch at launch. But now with the free update, Returns HD is packed full of content and has definitely proven itself as the definitive version. The world themes aren't quite on the same level of creativity and depth as DKC2 and Tropical Freeze, but Returns did exactly what it set out to do, bringing Donkey Kong Country back with a few new worlds to shake things up. And Retro shook up the entire platforming market with its well-designed, contextually driven platforming and silhouette levels, which have inspired tons of other game series, including Mario Wonder, which was a huge achievement for DK in the late 2000s. Most levels are still unique and entertaining regardless, especially the second half of the game. The Forest, Cliff, and Factory back-to-back is an insane lineup. Even I'll admit the first half can be pretty hit or miss if you find the first three worlds too boring. Like, wow, you're in the grassland, now you're on the beach, and then another grassland with a temple. Like, obviously, it's not the most groundbreaking in terms of themes, but every time I go back, I remember how creative the jungle was in terms of level design and graphical showcase. The level design is definitely the strongest aspect of both games, along with the 2.5D gameplay. The levels have a ton of creativity packed into each and every sequence to make them feel unique. Retro's design philosophy was incredibly groundbreaking for the time, between both Metroid Prime and Donkey Kong Country, and it really showed here the entire playthrough. through, even if I prefer some worlds to others. The 2.5D gimmick was also a great addition to the series, which pushed the mechanic further into the mainstream as a major platforming element. I especially enjoyed the minecart and rocket barrel levels. I lived for the adrenaline of only having 1 HP the entire level, trying to clench all the Kong letters and puzzle pieces. A lot of people aren't fond of these, but some of my most memorable moments of the game are within these levels. The minecart is a much different take in Returns than the original DKC, and I think the revamped physics for both the rocket barrel and minecart substantially improved the enjoyment of some worlds. Some of these later minecarts especially have you clenching the entire way through, and I love when a game requires 100% of my attention, so these are always a great change of pace. The bosses aren't anything to write home about. They all have different amounts of health, which can make them feel too simple or like a gauntlet. It's incredibly inconsistent. They are enjoyable at best to pretty bland at worst, but the levels more than make up for that. I will say though, they did lower the amount of hearts that spawn after damaging a boss. I really do appreciate that fix. Maybe that was a 3DS change and Forever just transferred it over, but now the bosses are actually punishing if you get hit. So while they still aren't that consistent or mind-blowing, they have slightly improved, at least to my knowledge. The 4K graphics on Switch 2 are definitely one of the highlights of this update and remaster in general. Returns has never looked this good, especially with the lighting fixes in this update. Returns feels even more complete now. I thought the Wii's graphics were ahead of its time. Nowadays, Returns isn't necessarily that impressive, but it's definitely one of the best looking platformers on Switch, even with the minor issues still present. Those bugs aren't even really noticeable anymore unless you're actively looking for them. The crazy part is that the game didn't even really need many texture upgrades in the first place. Returns is a gorgeous Wii game, and only going to age better on Switch. I've talked about the music extensively in my retrospective back in 2024. The soundtrack is fine. I kinda wish they would have brought David Wise back to redo this entire soundtrack, making it sound more consistent with Tropical Freeze, but there are technical reasons behind it, and I'll respect that. The soundtrack still holds a few hidden gems in the Donkey Kong Country series, however, it is definitely still overshadowed by the sequel. The 3DS exclusive levels are just a bonus, even if the main selling point is for the people who skipped the 3DS version. However, I didn't. I now have bought every version of Returns, so these levels don't really excite me as much as other people, but they're a fun lead up to the Golden Temple, I guess. To unlock these levels, you must get all the orbs from each K level in the original mode or buy them in the shop in modern mode. The K levels are some of the most skilled challenges in terms of testing you on game knowledge and precision. This is the peak difficulty of the game, so you'd think, how could World 9 top these levels? And the answer is they can't. Graphically and level idea wise, maybe, but definitely not difficulty. They're each a fresh take and remix of previous world themes, and have quite a few iconic elements, like the giant robot DK, or the Indiana Jones type level, where you run away from a spiked wall, and then have to climb upward between two spiked walls before they crash together, or the heavy tar droplets on the cliff, taking full advantage of the hazard it causes, and is one of my favorite levels in the entire game. These are all fantastic and new level ideas. I just don't know why they weren't added to the base worlds if they weren't going to be that difficult, at least compared to the K levels. Either way, these level ideas fit in with Returns so well that you may not even realize these levels weren't from the original game. Dixie is the most valuable but overpowered character in Returns HD, which might have some Wii purists raising an eyebrow, but I'm glad she's here. She made my recent playthrough of this game for this video very enjoyable, especially when her physics would break puzzles or just glitch out the game entirely. Multiplayer is much easier and honestly more enjoyable because of Dixie as well. Diddy was a fine character, but unless Nintendo adds some upside to his jetpack, he is pretty useless compared to Dixie, who can fly upward. Dixie, however, wasn't added to the pre-rendered cutscenes, so there's this funny switch animation taken from Tropical Freeze used multiple times at the end of the game. Multiplayer is something I would very much recommend to everyone watching this video, and since the multiplayer buffer bug was patched, the game is now finally beatable with 2 players, including the very difficult K levels, which is fantastic to see and adds so much replay value. It may not be perfect, with player 2 having an ability while base DK doesn't, but Returns is still fantastic to play with a friend. Game Share, on top of that, just gives accessibility to everyone, even if you don't live near the person you're trying to play with. I really am happy Forever Entertainment is keeping Country Returns alive by porting it to modern consoles and continuing to listen to criticism on the game and make changes. Could they maybe make some more changes so the file size isn't 16 gigabytes? I mean, probably. But maybe that's reserved for the Switch 2 edition we'll be getting in 2028.